Greetings and salutations, Monolithic Ethos here with my long and overdue finale to my three-part response to Second Thought's video, in which he subverts the concepts of freedom to whitewash his tyrannical Marxist agenda. So far, I have exposed Chapman's attempt to play armchair historian, which he fails miserably, as evident by the numerous historical inaccuracies he spewed. However, Part 3 will focus on his attempt to discredit the liberal embodiment of freedom by arguing that capitalism actually oppresses freedom, or what Second Thought deems to be freedom. But first, I want to clear up a slight mistake in my criticism of Second Thought, and when I mean by slight, I mean so minimal that it doesn't really redeem Chapman of his credibility. In fact, it actually makes him more subversive. In part 2 of my response, I pointed out that Second Thought misrepresented Aristotle's stance on freedom as being interchanged with democracy, when in reality he wasn't a fan of absolute democracy, believing it to be mob rule that would lead to the demise of freedom. I initially implied that he never brought this up or clarified Aristotle's anti-democratic stances, but he technically did. Somewhat, in a slippery way. And this comes after he conflates Aristotle's notion of equal and alternating rule with direct democracy, making us believe that Aristotle was some sort of neolib.
On his end, Aristotle chose to formulate these freedoms in a political context by making negative freedom, freedom from coercion, tangible with his notion of equal and alternating rule, and positive freedom, freedom too, by ensuring one's ability to live as they please. For these conditions to be freedom, the very basis of a democratic society according to Aristotle, it is crucial that people must be equal in their political power. This is the variable that distinguishes democracies from other systems of government. Specifically, democracy is a system of popular sovereignty, in direct contradiction with a society where the more prosperous, the wealthy, can utilize their wealth as political power.
However, he makes a sloppy attempt to address Aristotle's anti-democratic stances when elaborating on leisure as a concrete example of freedom, acknowledging that aristocracy was Aristotle's preferred system.
But Aristotle doesn't stop there. He substantiates these relatively fungible concepts with a concrete example of freedom: leisure. One of the great tests of liberty is to be free to engage in leisurely activities, activities that bring pleasure, happiness, and are distinct from work. To have the freedom to do things for their own sake. Aristotle separates this freedom from democratic freedom so he can justify his preferred form of government, aristocracy. But this split ultimately doesn't matter. Leisure has just become enshrined as one of the measures of liberty.
However, once again, Second Thought still leaves off Aristotle's criticisms of democracy, as it would conflict with his narrative that socialism is the purest form of freedom. Speaking of leisure, this brings me to the main discussion that I will be going over for this video. Second Thought makes the point that leisure is an essential component of liberty, and he ties this with the condemnation of Western liberalism and capitalism, asserting that current perception of freedom is a product of Cold War propaganda and that capitalism is in reality, quote-unquote, demonstrably unfree because it's a system that is built upon wage slavery and class hierarchy.
Although prominent American political figures like Eugene Debs and FDR, alongside massive social labor movements, resisted this definition of individualized freedom and market domination, the final nail in the coffin came with the Cold War. The Cold War pitted the supposedly free against the unfree world. And once that battle had been won by the neoliberal West, its vision of freedom came to dominate political language. Freedom became impossible to disentangle from capitalism. While it's conceptually tempting to see this as the victory of one form of freedom over another, that is not the case. Capitalism and freedom have a purely adversarial relationship. Despite constantly being told that the two terms are synonymous, a capitalist regime all but eliminates freedom in economic matters, and so by extension, in social affairs.
But hey, it is correct to believe that our perception of freedom had any influence from the Cold War, because to compare the US aligned nations and the communist bloc, it is correct to conclude that the liberal democratic republican system of the West is far more free than the totalitarian, repressive, and unfree dictatorships of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Chapman wouldn't care anyway, as he is a tankie with a mission to whitewash the infamous legacy of communism. But let's move on to his stance that capitalism suppresses freedom, that capitalism deprives individuals of their liberty as they have no choice but to work as a means of survival, divesting their leisure rights for wage labor.
As you'll recall from earlier in this episode, one of the tests of liberty for Aristotle was the ability to enjoy leisure time. Leisure, in a sense, is a form of freedom that distinguishes human liberty from coercion and constraint, notably in the domain of work. As you can expect from a system that places such dramatic constraints on your life and such an emphasis on work as capitalism, the place of leisure is greatly marginalized. Freedom is marginalized. Leisure is restricted to only a few days of the week, and only to the very most fortunate. Few are the people who have the energy after a day of hard work to enjoy music and poetry as Aristotle did, to read a good book, to exercise, to take pleasure in life. And when you do get the chance, it's usually to recharge for the upcoming week. Leisure does not have a central place in a capitalist system because its enjoyment alone does not drive profits.
There are two facts that second thought negates when addressing capitalism and leisure. That one, leisure time has been increasing over the years. This is thanks to the advancement of automation and pioneers like Henry Ford who popularized the 5-day, 40-hour work week. And two, work and industry are what create leisures in the first place. Second thought can't be that ignorant to comprehend the amount of time and labor required for the majority of our leisure activities such as music, reading, and playing video games. Music albums can take months or even years to finish, comprising of weeks or months of writing and rehearsals for one song. There's also a necessity for skilled labor to record and tune the audio, not forgetting to mention the expensive equipment used. Then there's the additional amount of workers and labor in pumping up a mass amount of copies and shipping them to retailers throughout the country. That's not even the last of it when considering the medium and mechanisms required for the jams to be listened to. Radio, CD players, cassette players, Walkmans, iPods, and smartphones are commodities that exist because of the hard work, time, and effort in making and distributing them. The same thing applies when publishing books, movies, and video games. They require tons and tons of skilled labor and time to produce. Even activity-type leisures like fishing, hunting, skateboarding, etc., there's labor involved. Fishing rods, nets, and bait are essential for fishing, which are produced through labor. The same thing applies to guns, bullets, skateboards, and skating ramps. No matter what type of leisure, one cannot escape the capitalist mode of production. Even under socialism, leisure existed as a byproduct of the black market, namely X-ray vinyl records and bootleg copies of Hollywood films. Granted, the USSR had a successful movie industry. However, what is regarded as the golden age of Soviet cinema came at a time in which the film industry was privatized as part of Lenin's new economic policy. Shifting my attention back to second thought, he insists that we are not free under capitalism because according to him, most people are forced to work to live, especially in jobs that pays too little for the value of their labor that an employee provides.
Capitalism and freedom have a purely adversarial relationship. Despite constantly being told that the two terms are synonymous, a capitalist regime all but eliminates freedom in economic matters, and so by extension, in social affairs. Of course, defenders of this system will say this is not the case. After all, capitalism provides us daily with the freedom to make personal decisions as consumers. Not only is this form of freedom incredibly limited, the great majority of our economic system is demonstrably unfree for most people. We see this play out most clearly in the domain of work. While capitalism sells us the idea of workers as consumers, who get to select from a catalog of meaningless jobs for the way to spend the majority of their waking hours, the exact opposite is true. People are forced into jobs for wages that rarely ever justify their efforts, for hours they do not choose, and in conditions they can't improve. Sure, we're free to not take a job we don't like, but on the other side of that decision is an economy where everything essential has been privatized. Your home, your food, your water and electricity, the services that you need to live, like hospital care. Every part of your basic survival requires you to accept this bad deal. There's no freedom between the choice of work and death, and our capitalist system makes that clear. Work lifts us out of a poverty manufactured by a system where jobs are the entry ticket to bare survival, and any form of economic security is rare.
Chapman at least acknowledged that working at a minimum wage job is a choice. but he poorly reinforces the wage slave rhetoric with an either-or argument, that under capitalism the only choices are to work in a job that might provide little when it comes to income, or be in complete poverty with no access to life essentials. Like most instances of the either-or fallacy, there are more choices than just two. Under capitalism, one can start their own business and be their own boss. One can be self-employed, one can work at home, and one can buy and trade stocks. A major development of the job market is the rise of remote at-home work, which has shown now comprise an increased percentage of high-paying jobs and has statistically been proven to be a more productive, less stressful alternative to office work. Chapman himself is a self-made man who makes a successful living by profiting out of making Marxist propaganda on YouTube. He was able to turn his at-home hobby into a full-fledged job in which he is his own boss and uses the fruits of his labor to do what he loves. So whenever he complains about minimum wage jobs being the only available opportunities within a capitalist economy, he is the living example of the opposite. To insist that a socialist system would resolve workers' freedom is an utter joke, as demonstrated by communist regimes that enacted laws that force people to work. For instance, in the USSR, one can be imprisoned for a year for being 20 minutes late from work, and abruptly quitting or changing jobs can get you 3 years sentence in a gulag. Not to mention that communism is on record the largest institution of slavery in the past century due to its institutionalization of forced labor camps. In regards to his argument that consumers aren't free because of essential goods and services are privatized, it negates that a free market enables competition, which leads to more variety in consumer goods and lower prices. The monopolies that leftists cite as instances of capitalist resource tyranny is in reality a consequence of government intervention, and although the American healthcare system is an utter fiscal nightmare, the high cost of medical care is not the fault of the free market, but rather cronyism and state agencies such as the FDA hindering medical research and inflating prices. I won't delve deeper into the subject of US healthcare, as that would drift away from the discussion on freedom. I will point out that consumer choices is one of the cores of freedom. Within a free market, there's a variety of different competing options that one can choose from. This comes in the form of brands and corporations dueling it out in the open market. Leftists, despite publicly condemning monopolies, are in reality advocating for the biggest form of monopoly, that being the complete government control of the economy. Under communism, you can kiss your favorite brands goodbye. In a socialist-run market, it is considered satisfactory to see an entire aisle stockpiled with one brand of canned mangoes, though you can only expect that on a lucky Wednesday, which has gradually been less common over the years, so don't be surprised to see empty shelves. Second Thought makes his final statement, in which he tries to brand socialism as less coercive and freer alternative to capitalism by addressing the two virtues that embody the quote-unquote leftist conception of freedom, the first being freedom from coercion.
The reason I am this insistent on the harms to freedom a capitalist system produces is because there are better alternatives. Under socialist organizations of the economy, the economic coercion seen under capitalist regimes virtually disappears, and freedom takes its place. This is a product of the more complete understanding of freedom on the left. The leftist conception of freedom hinges on two things. First, the ability one has to make decisions free from coercion, which critically includes constraints like acute precarity, lack of resources, and economic coercion, unlike the limited conception of coercion as only coming from governments and individuals in the conservative definition.
As I pointed out in my previous video on positive liberty, which if you haven't seen yet, you should definitely check it out, leftists are lying when they claim to be anti-coercive, as they do believe in coercion to reinforce the common good, even in the dismay of one's individual free will. Now, the second virtue of freedom under socialism brought up by Chapman is democratic self-governance.
Second, as the history of the left-wing struggle for liberty demonstrates, freedom is also a product of democratic self-governance. Since a socialist economy is based on prioritizing the provision of food, water, shelter, and medicine for all, not blindly following the profit motive or depriving people of these basic needs, eliminating the great majority of resource constraints, and granting workers democratic control over the economy, it actually delivers on the promise of freedom. Without poverty and an undemocratic economy standing in your way, you are free to live out your life as you see fit.
To prioritize the supply of goods and resources while simultaneously disregard profit, prices, and property rights would undoubtedly result in an ineffective supply chain and shortages. In the real world, there is not an infinite amount of resources, a fact that Marxists refuse to acknowledge. Prices, profit, and competition under a free market is proven to be the best system of distributing goods. Prices ensures that the supply of resources are taken into account, while competition and profit encourages retailers to incentivize reasonable prices as a way to pursue more customers in the hopes of further financial gain. Socialist methods of stabilizing supply, such as production quotas and collectivization, has repeatedly resulted in shortages and mass famines that would cost the lives of millions, such as the Great Leap Forward famine that occurred in Maoist China from 1959 to 1961. Anyway, we have reached the end of Second Thought's video, so I will end my response with a final conclusion. Second Thought may have started out his YouTube career imitating educational channels like Real Life Lore or the Infographic Show, but have unfortunately fallen in the same trap as the likes of the Cynical Historian and Step Back History. However, Chapman has definitely had a higher dose of the infamous Marxist Kool-Aid to the point that his political obsession has overtaken his channel. The evolution of his content is quite visible, shifting from videos that explore concepts such as the existence of alien life, outdated historical predictions of the future, and time travel, to propaganda such as those demonizing political centrists for being quote-unquote far right, or videos whitewashing communist dictators like Fidel Castro. It is tragic to see a once decent content creator descend into a oxymoronic keyboard revolutionary who doesn't even live by the values that he preaches. Though I do have to admit that I do enjoy his luxury car reviews. Hopefully he finds his way out of the commie rabbit hole so he can go back to riding Ferraris for the sake of entertaining suckers like me who can only dream to upgrade from my rundown 2009 Hyundai Sonata. Anyway, please like and share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. Oh, and remember that all commies are bad.